you very much for this very warm welcome and for organizing this virtual visit. I'm very grateful to Clarice for inviting me, and for everybody else, and Will and Andrea and Bianca for organizing this session. And it's truly a pleasure and an honor to be able to share with you this work, because as was said, this is not just the Management and Leadership and Organizations Department of Middlesex University, but also specifically a cluster on research and diversity. And then as I understood, there are also some members of SIGNET. And so I've often presented this work to more strategy-oriented people. And so it's a pleasure for that to talk with more gender-oriented and diversity-oriented scholars as well. Broadly speaking, my research addresses two main questions around diversity and inclusion. One set of questions is, why is it that we keep having these persistent differences in the career trajectories of men and women, or people of different races and ethnicities? And what are the mechanisms that explain these persisting differences in our experiences, in our career trajectories, and in the outcomes associated with that? And to answer those questions, I've used both a psychology frame, so understanding, for example, the experience of work-family conflict, or what makes for a good leader in teams, or what kinds of behaviors on the part of female leaders might generate trust in followers, as well as using a structural lens. So looking at the relative power and status and numbers of different groups within society, and how that affects the allocation of opportunities, for example. So those two fields don't always talk together, but I think there's a lot a lot of value in bringing those areas together. The second set of questions that my research addresses has to do with diversity in groups. And the question is, how and when can diversity help a group perform better? And what are some of the things that we can do to avoid or mitigate that diversity derails a group? And so here I've looked at some aspects of team diversity, for example, R&D teams, but also teams of founders of new ventures, looking at affective diversity, deep level diversity. And I guess the bulk of my work that I'm probably most known for at this point in time is my work on diversity at upper echelons on boards, as well as in top management teams, which is the topic of the research for today. So the study that I present today draws, and that's why I'm excited about it, draws from the research on career experiences and the differences of men and women in their career experiences to explain what happens when women join the C-suite or the executive team or the top management team. I'll use those terms interchangeably. So this brings me to the study that I'm sharing with you today. I want to introduce, by the way, my two colleagues, Boris Lokshin and Christophe Boone. We had a really wonderful time, and we're a great team, excellent colleagues. And for those of you who are more maybe junior scholars in the room here, I think you'll be relieved to hear about that it's probably not just you struggling and needing a lot of time to get things published. I was looking back at the work we've done with Boris and Christophe, and this work started in December 2016. I was giving a talk at Maastricht, and we started kicking around some ideas. We have exchanged over 800 emails. We spent countless hours in meetings talking together, and went through multiple rounds of revisions and resubmissions until this was finally accepted for publication at Academy of Management. So persistence is the name of the game. It takes time, but it's worth it. And the question that formed the basis for this paper is one that's frustrated researchers for quite a while. The question is, what really happens when women enter top management team? So there's an impressive amount of work that links women on boards or women on top management teams with firm outcomes. But we still don't know quite, what that process is that might connect, on the one hand, just adding or composition of a board or top management team with a change in how the firm is doing or how it operates. And so that's a question that's been really vexing me, and I think many others in this space as well. And if you like, perhaps the best way to describe the current research on women on top management teams and firm strategy or firm outcomes is too much describing, too little explaining. If you look at the bulk of the research in this area, a lot of it is cross-sectional, so looking at composition and firm outcomes at the same point in time, which we know can't tell us anything about causality or mechanisms. A lot of it, surprisingly, compares firms with each other, and rather than comparing or examining what happens after a woman joins a group or a team, or when that composition changes, what happens later on, what changes within the firm. And so for those reasons, we really don't know what sort of magic operates, or what is that process that leads from one thing to another. And so our goal here is really to move from the descriptive, showing the link, to explaining, to explanatory. How does this linkage occur? In addition to this limitation in existing studies, if you look at the research more broadly about women and strategy, there's also an interesting tension that I observed. So there's a nice body of work connecting women in top management teams or CEOs or boards with firm risk. And the premise there is because women tend to be on average more risk averse than men, firms that have more women were going to be less risk taking. So there's less risk. And then on the side of that research, there's another set of papers and research looking at firm innovation. And here the argument is, when women join the top management team or the boards or become CEOs, women are more creative, more willing to see, to challenge the status quo. And so we see more innovation. And it seems to me there's a little bit of a tension here that at least hasn't been resolved so far in the literature between this idea that women are both more risk averse and also more willing to challenge the status quo. And so that's a tension also that I think is a limitation in the research, because it hasn't been addressed. So after doing quite some reading, and perhaps as a function of the composition of our co-author team, we settled on the strategic renewal literature as the main framework that we think can help us address the questions that I laid out before. So the strategic renewal literature has shown that when there are new executives that join a firm, firms change their strategy. If a new CEO comes on board, firms start doing things differently. What was interesting too is that in this research too, there still is a limited understanding of what factors trigger that change and how exactly it happens that you have that change at that top level and a strategic direction change, because we know that that's something that's hard to implement and get into place. And so again, for us, we saw this as an opening for resolving these theoretical gaps, because there is literature linking executive appointments to firm strategy, and also as a way with our paper to contribute back to that literature and show a little bit how that might occur. So strategic renewal, for those of you who might not be as familiar with it, I certainly wasn't when we started out in this area, is you want to think of it, at least that's why I put this image up here of these rails shifting, right? Of a firm going down one particular strategic path and then altering that path to try to reach the same goal, right? So it's the process that allows organizations to alter their path dependency. Firms are straddled with a lot of inertia. And so how do we change our capabilities so that we can slightly change directions and trajectories over time? And in our particular study, we're interested in strategic renewal related to innovation. So what that means is the processes that allow organizations to switch and alter how they go about innovating. What are their innovation capabilities? And when you think about strategies for innovations, there are two main paths for strategic renewal. There are two main paths for remaining competitive on a strategic perspective or strategy on an innovation strategy. One might be acquiring capabilities. So looking around for what's out there, what might be some small firms or other firms with specific capabilities, and going out there and acquiring them. So mergers and acquisitions. So mergers and acquisitions is one pathway. It's typically a risky one because mergers and acquisitions are notorious for failing. And in part, that's because it's difficult for an outsider to really assess whether the capabilities you think you're acquiring are the ones that exist in that firm. And it's also risky for executives because these mergers and acquisitions tend to have high visibility. And so if you screw up, it's going to come back and hurt you from a career standpoint. But that's one way to go about renewing and doing strategic renewal and an innovation standpoint. The other option is to build internally your capabilities. Perhaps the most illustrative way is hiring scientists, or specifically or developing scientists, building labs, building processes that nurture innovation, finding ways to get people together that don't necessarily talk together, to think about how you can reconfigure existing resources. So it's about this internal development, building of capabilities. And each of these strategies requires quite a lot of work and attention. So while most large firms do a little bit of both, or do both, firms typically have one main pathway they go down, right? So firms like Roche, for example, invests heavily internally in capability building and capability making in terms of innovation. And of course, also does mergers and acquisitions, but that's sort of not their main strategy for innovation. And other firms are very much based on acquiring. So coming back to the question that interests us, and that's this question of how does appointing women lead to strategic change? What we're proposing is that we're proposing that what changes is the ways in which the top management team thinks after a woman joins the top management team. And we think that that might be the link that explains why a strategy, an innovation strategy, might change as well. So our model is dynamic because it really thinks about the role of time. So what happens, you appoint a woman, you're changing the composition of that top management team. How does that, later in time, change how the top management team thinks? And then once you take time into consideration, how does that even later down the road change the firm's innovation strategy? Our model is also dynamic because we're going to be looking at what changes within firms rather than comparing firms to each other. And our analytical strategy, which is difference in difference analysis, also is one that can talk to causality. And our approach also allows us to resolve this theoretical tension around gender differences in risk-taking propensity and in change orientation. Again, when you think about strategic renewal, there are multiple pathways to the same outcome. And so in this study, we're not really interested in do women increase performance or not, and to what extent, but do having women on boards, does bringing women on perhaps change the process or the way in which we seek to achieve the same outcome, in this case, innovation. And we'll show that that's the case here. Okay, so we know that the values and the experiences and the personalities of individuals on the top management team, so the CEOs, the vice presidents, and so forth, that their ways of thinking, their experiences drive strategic decisions. So that's the sort of the bread and butter of upper echelons theory by Hamburg and Mason, and others have attended to this as well. And when we think about the top management team cognition, we're thinking about the prevailing and collective way of thinking about particular situations and where the top management team collectively puts their attention. And in our study, we thought to look at two top management team cognitions, two different ways of thinking that are not two sides of the same axis, but they're somewhat orthogonal. One is the risk-taking propensity. What this alludes to is the level of comfort and preference for doing risky things with limited assurance that it will succeed. So we don't need, when we have a high risk-taking propensity, we're willing to embark into alternatives without fully knowing or needing an assurance that it's going to succeed. What contributes to this? Executives' overconfidence, both in their own abilities as well as in the abilities of their firm to succeed. It also reflects perhaps an underestimation of the negative outcomes, or you're not really seeing negative outcomes as very costly. So that's risk-taking propensity. Separately, the second top management team cognition is change orientation. And change orientation is somewhat similar, if you like, to this notion, this personality trait of openness to change, has to do with this tendency to want to experiment, to try new things, to not be attached to old ways of doing. It requires some resilience. It requires the willingness and ability to change one's mind, to accept that one might be wrong. And it also has a long-term focus, right? When you're going to experiment and try things out, you have to be comfortable with gradual improvements, and you also are comfortable with the fact that you can't quite know the results, that those will happen in the long term. Okay, so now we have all the pieces in place, I think, right? I explained the problem with the current state of research on women on top management teams and firm outcomes. I clarified what the strategic renewal focus is. We worked out that research and development investments and mergers and acquisitions are two separate pathways to achieve firm innovation. And now we've defined these two cognitions that are going to be central to our study, both of which I think you will agree are central to innovation. And so we get to the question then of what happens within the C-suite or within the top management team after women break that glass ceiling and enter, and also why might that entrance to the top management team shift the firm's pathway to strategic renewal. And this is where I come back to the research on women's careers. We know that women's path to these executive positions is quite different from that of men. Typically, women that succeed and sustain and persist in these roles and get to this level have had to do a few things. They've had to demonstrate that they're outstanding performers. They've had to stand out in some sort of way. And they often do that by promoting new ideas or new visions and garnering support around that. At the same time, because there are so few of them, and because they're often the only women in their group, they're under a lot of, and because they're not seen as necessarily legitimate in these upper echelons, they're under a lot of scrutiny. They can't avoid to make mistakes. If they make a mistake, they're much harshly punished. Their career derails much more quickly. So based on this understanding of women's careers, we assume, and again, we're not the only ones saying this, that women, when they enter the C-suite, are both more oriented towards change, doing things differently, as well as less willing to take, bold and crazy risks where we really are overestimating our capabilities. So if that's the case, this brings us to our first hypothesis. So we hypothesize that because women are entering the top management team and have been shaped by their experience to be more risk averse as well as more innovative, that when they enter the top management team overall shifts their thinking to become more oriented towards change and also to be less willing to take risks, outlandish risks. And the reasons for that are severalfold. One, when you, and here we pull also on some literature on newcomer socialization, or what happens when new people enter groups. We know that when people are more oriented towards change, that they're, fundamentally more willing to challenge the status quo, they can also get others to become more receptive to change. And others see the possibility or the feasibility of implementing some ideas that are novel and different, so that can increase others' confidence and change the group's orientation to become more oriented or open to change. We also know from the research on cautious shifts and risky shifts in teams that when a member enters a group and others in that group perceive that person to be risk averse, everybody on the team starts thinking that the other person is more risk averse than they really are. And then they downgrade their own levels of comfort with risk, and as such, now the whole group becomes more willing to take risks. So we connect sort of the mindsets that women bring to these top management teams with a shift in how the top management team thinks. There's also research on diversity that just shows that when you have more diverse groups, more ideas is exchanged. We realize now different possibilities, so that can help a top management team become more change-oriented. And similarly, when you have a diverse group, you have to slow down your decision-making process anyway, and that helps mitigate risk-taking. So, but those are our two central hypotheses here. Okay, so I guess what I was trying to say is that we know that for newcomers to be able to influence a group, they need to be relatively well integrated. So we do have a couple, or actually three, moderating hypotheses here that say, you know, the more integrated women are into that top management team, the more the top management team's thinking is going to shift. And when we think about integration, we look at whether there are female incumbents or not on that top management team. If there are female incumbents, they can often help the newcomers understand more quickly the top management team dynamics, or the men on that group maybe are also more comfortable working with women, and so it facilitates the newcomers' integration. And the second aspect of integration is the size of the cohort of newcomers. So every year, if there's a change in the composition of the top management team, it can be more or less big. Maybe the woman's the only one entering, in which case we would expect more of an influence. But if suddenly half of the executive team is switched around, there are all sorts of dynamics that perhaps dilute the effect of having that new woman on the corporate in the C-suite. So, but I don't want to get us too much on a tangent here. I want to focus on the main storyline. Our main storyline says that once or after women have joined in this top management team and created this change in top management team change orientation, we expect to see a greater increase, so a shift towards more R&D. If you remember those train tracks, right? A shift towards more R&D. And we expect that the reason for that is that, as I mentioned before, when you have more of a change orientation mindset, you suddenly become more willing and more flexible to see how you can create new opportunities internally. You become more of a believer in the capabilities of R&D to uncover new ideas, and you see more value in developing and maintaining your capabilities and connecting your knowledge in new and different ways. So that's our first hypothesis. And then the second one is mirrors that one and says, you know, if following women's appointments to the C-suite, the top management team reduces its propensity for risk-taking, we also think it's going to shift away and move away from mergers and acquisitions, right? So again, as a group, when we become more risk averse, what happens is we're not comfortable with uncertainty and change. We prefer change that's something that's more within our control. We suddenly start seeing more potential downsides to a risky situation, and we become maybe, I would say, more pessimistic or more realistic or less overconfident in the outcomes of a risky scenario. And as I said before, mergers and acquisitions are risky. I mean, they're notoriously they're notorious in that they fail very often, and they hold career risk for the executives that push for them. And I realize this might be a little bit small, but I think you'll get the general idea here. As we move from left to right, we're also moving over time. So in our model, we're saying, you know, if at time from time 0 to time 1, we have new women joining the top management team, we expect that will create a change between that time 1 and time 2 in the way the top management team thinks. And we then expect that change in thinking to translate later on, a year later, in shifts away from mergers and acquisitions towards more R&D. So that's what this model here shows, again, the role of time and the dynamic nature of our model, and summarize it for some of you who maybe might be more visual. So I'm going to move now into sharing with you a little bit of the data and the results of our study, so you get a sense of where we, what we use to test our ideas. So we used a sample of multinational firms from 20 different OECD countries. All of these firms were involved in strategic innovation, so that's what they do. And we have data on a period of 13 years. And typically for each firm on average, we have almost 12 years of data. So you can really see change over time. For this study, we also drew our data from a variety of sources, the usual ones you could expect, like Board X for data about executives, CompuStat and DataStream for information about the firm's balance sheet and firm level data. We also drew from SDC and Zephyr for merger and acquisition data. We had some controls for patents, so we had a data set for that. And then because we have multiple countries in our study, we control for country level variables. So we used other data sets from the ILO and the World Economic Forum for that. So broad sets of data. Our variables, when we talk about top management team appointments and those members, we're looking at individuals who are at least at the rank of VP or are on the board, on the executive board of directors. For mergers and acquisition, I just want to specify these are tech-based mergers and acquisitions. So we wanted to really stick within that notion of innovation strategy, and R&D is the what's listed on the balance sheet as investments in R&D. What you're probably most curious about is how we went about measuring how top management teams think, right? How in the world do we go and measure that? We certainly did not survey them, but we relied on research and on other work that says, how executives think is reflected in how they talk and how they write. And so what we did is we collected the letters to the shareholders for all those firms, for all those years for each firm, and we content analyzed this. And so that's the advantage of using content analysis and text analysis, is that it's pretty unobtrusive. So we're not, concerned by surveying executives who will tell us what they might think we want to hear. And we can also think of those texts as top management level, because usually it's a text that goes through multiple iterations, and all these executives have some say in it as well. We used validated word dictionaries. So there are word dictionaries that say, if you see these sorts of words, this reflects that sort of cognition. And I'll share those with you in a second. We did count those words using LIWC software by Pennebaker and others. So let me give you a sense of what those words are. I'm not going to read them out, but this is the dictionary from Short, Broberg, and Coglitzer and Brigham. These words, if you see them pop up, and if they pop up with some regularity, would reflect risk-taking propensity. So you can see how it's really about risk and gamble and venture and wager and audacious, right? And these words suggest change orientation. This is a different dictionary by McClelland, Lang, and Barker III. And you can see here it's about change, initiating, introducing, launching, and so forth. And as part of our appendixes for this paper, we pulled out and tried to show within a firm changes in the language. So this particular firm, you see parts of the text from those letters to shareholders. On the left is text from 2009, on the right text from 2010. Our scores, our measures of risk-taking propensity went down from 2019 to 2010 from 0.51 to 0.14. And our measures of change orientation, the way we computed that, right? So went from 0.14 to 0.57, so went up. And you can see, I don't know, and hopefully you can if you sort of peer into this. On the left, all the words that are surrounded by these continuous line squares are about risk. So the word here, in this case, risk, comes up a lot, and that's usually one that came up a lot. And then you can see on the right how the word risk sort of disappears, and there's words like create and change and develop and launch and innovate. And so that was one way for us to illustrate, although we didn't go in and look at these words for each one, we used that program that sort of goes through the text. That gives you an idea of how that language shifts. And we were really actually we weren't super optimistic going into it that we were going to find changes in language from one year to the other, because these documents also go through corporate lawyers and there's sort of a format for these happen. But we do, I mean, pretty striking changes, right? And so I've probably already given away the findings here, but they do correlate with changes in the top management team. We control for a lot of things. We control for explanations at the CEO level, the top management team level, the firm level, and the country level as well, to try to really focus our results that we know it's about this change in the composition of the board, of the top management team, I'm sorry. And we often control for changes in other things. So we're not just controlling statically, but we're saying, was there a change in the presence of a CEO, or did the tenure diversity change? So we looked at changing all these things because we wanted really to isolate how the change in the gender composition of the top management team affected the changes in thinking and strategy. We robustness checked this thing in every which way you can imagine. Our reviewers were very creative, and so were we in making sure we knew that our results held, and for the most part they do. There's some interesting quirks, but one of the cool robustness checks that did not make it into the paper, that was one of my favorite, was the fact that when you had female exiting from the top management team, you had the reverse happening, right? So when women on the top management team exited, the cognition of the top management team became again more risk oriented and less change oriented. So I thought that was pretty cool. Maybe it'll make it in another paper. But our first finding is that, yes, we do find that after women join the top management team, their risk-taking propensity decreases. Our numbers show that it's on average about by 14%, and top management change orientation increases by about 10%. So our hypotheses there are supported. As I mentioned, we wanted to identify that it was important for these women to be integrated into the top management team. And we did find, to the large extent, that when there was already female incumbents on the top management team, or when there were small cohorts of new members to the top management team, those changes that we have in point one here were larger. And then finally, we did show that once there was a shift away from risk-taking, that mergers and acquisition became less prevalent. And as a function of the shift of the top management team in openness and change orientation, there was more investment of growth and a focus on internal R&D. So for the most part, that model was well supported. I guess what I see as the big really contribution and implications, and I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on how this might intersect with your own work. But to me, this was really important. That's why I'm so excited about this paper. It's really one of my favorites, to show that dynamic model, to show what is happening. Why are we getting from A to B? You know, it's not like a little magic ingredient we just throw in and sort of poof, something happens at the other end. There's actually a process, something that's unfolding here. We also provide this novel mechanism, right? A shift in how the top management team as a whole thinks. So it's not just about a woman thinking differently and that just being an isolated effect, but it actually changes and shifts how the top management team thinks. And by offering that novel mechanism, we're moving the conversation from does adding women change what happens in firms, to explaining how it happens. We're hoping this might prompt additional research on what might be some other ways of thinking in which that change on a top management team when women join. So for example, I have a different study on how adding women to boards of directors speeds up the recall of products that are harmful to customers in the medical device industry. Is it perhaps because the moral sensitivities also change on that top management team? So it'd be interesting to think about other cognitions. And again, we're coming back then to the strategic renewal literature to offer some thoughts about what triggers change and what changes actually are happening that create these shifts in trajectories for firms. And also, what's neat about this study, at least for me, because that was always bothering me, that notion of how can women be both more risk averse and open to change? Well, there are different pathways to innovation, to outcomes, and so we can sort of resolve that in this way. So that's about it for me. And I'm more than happy. I was noticing that there were some things popping up in the chat, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions. I think we'll do this in a moderated fashion. But thank you very much for the opportunity to share with you this project.